Hashi delay. We had to get that for the video. So some of you seem to be concerned that I'm barefoot. Back in Atlanta, I can't teach barefoot. So this is a great break for me. It also helps me stay cool. All right, so in year 2, we're going to focus on sensory systems. Is it advanced? Good. Okay. So in the first lecture, we're going to talk about how we study sensory systems. And like all areas of science, we use what's referred to as the scientific method to study sensory systems. Do you remember the scientific method from last year? Yes. Any volunteers to describe it to me? Okay, the first step is having a question. And then having a hypothesis. Experiment. Very good. Collection of data. Very good. So whether we test the hypothesis is true or not. If it's not, we reject this idea. Very good. Very good. So this is going to be easy. All right, so our learning objectives for today's lecture are to describe the scientific method as a model of inquiry. And it sounds like you all know that now. Then we're going to talk about how a sensory stimulus is transduced into electrical signals. And then we'll talk about the environmental stimuli for each sense. And as you'll see, there are specific primary receptor cells for each of our senses. And these are very specific. Okay, so here's a diagram that illustrates the scientific method. Okay. The first thing is to make an observation. Then, as you said, we ask a question. That allows us to then form a hypothesis. And it's very important that we design our hypothesis such that it can be falsified.
Tanda zumba Drepung la jura dinde yonghingi ni ngazugi tanda namchaji shagiruwas chobaji shagires tubures dinde.
So when the scientific method is used properly, we design experiments to actually try and disprove our own hypothesis.
Dila de tang anzugi choba shagyo jura dila pa be anzugi tagjeji chigres di tagjeji gyuni anzugi ta tanda ni choba shagyo di zumba Drepung imbaji tungyu yores.
And so then we conduct that experiment and collect the data.
And di tagje di che an tagje che sa tagje gi gyuni kharagir la na ngazo thangdo ragyo res thangdo digyo res.
If we fail to falsify the hypothesis, to prove that it's wrong, then we have support for that hypothesis.
Dila de tuba Drepung la jura dinde ngazo gi ten tuba ina ani ngazo ngara chu gi social dilata roba chinge gyabgyor chinge roji radio chungyo res.
However, if we do falsify it, then we have to go back and form a new hypothesis.
Ta zumba Drepung ina strong zugi ani ya dijela kharchigilana choba shimbaji chigres sawaji.
And so that puts us back to here.
Chezanta zumba tanda tul de hako ina sti zumba imba Drepung jela ani ya social shimbaji chigres.
And so in all aspects of science, we are constantly making new hypotheses, testing them, retesting them to try and get at the truth.
Ta cheri gi thablam na kharchigila na ngaran chugi choba shagres an choba di tagje chinia zuba thuba imba hakona kyar tu tagje chi kya tu ta choba sha dile chigures.
And we're going to have much more in-depth information about the scientific method in the afternoon session.
Ta tanda cheri gi thablam jura di korla an tanda shela parsing gi jela ani ngazu lopti chi yis.
And so for the afternoon session, for some of the activities, we're going to split the class in two.
Ta ningu shela gi parsing gi jela ta chego indi chigres ra chego khashina khari chego gurlana anzu jinda di rugani la gugres.
But for today, we're going to have everyone come back at 1:30.
Ta ine tharing khari lana rugani sumes jinda chajang tanda lobdu changma chuju thangbo da chaga la zong gugures tharing.
Oh yes, and here, in here.
Zomsa thagarang res jinda dila.
Okay. So I want you to think about this. What are some phenomena that can be measured easily, and what other phenomena might be more difficult to measure?
Ta tanda chuni mangbu juros ni khari khari nganzo cheje lela chagures khari khari cheje khakbu chagures.
So in neuroscience, we're generally concerned with phenomena that we can observe and that we can measure.
Ta nganzo wangza cheri na la khande ji lingyor lawa na chuni nganzo gi chipta che thue che nganzo gi cheje thue dige rigla lawa changures.
And the senses are things that we can look at and make hypotheses about.
Ta tanda wangzo da de changma khari chagurla na nganzo gi thoya yo che choba sha yo dinde chagyoros.
So there are basic steps to experience.
Nganzo nyongwa yora dila ani rimba do khorim do jyorwas dila.
We have to sense something. So if we're looking at this glass of chai, we have to look at it and sense it.
Ta chor go yoroas thangbo di khari chagurla ni di roji cha shawanas di chai porba joroas di ta go yoroas ta ni chor go yores.
When we do that, that creates electrical signals in the retina, which is the neural part of the back of the eye.
Ta tanda dende chiyo kapsu khari chigyor lawa na anzo mi gi thagi yorwas thagi la ni logi dat ni di thagi la di khari chagorla na mi gyap gi chashe chigyorwas di.
But the retina doesn't know that this is a glass of chai.
Ine mi gi thagi jorwa di khari ha ku yo mar lawa nas di chai porba imba ha ku yo mares thagi digi.
But a series of electrical signals are created in the retina that are then transferred to the brain.
Ine logi daji tungu resra thagina di ani dadi khol dugur launa chig jel chik thuni level tangu res.
And it is within the brain that we interpret this as a glass of chai.
Cheza an leben na la nganzu khari ha shegur lawaina ta di chai porba jire shas la ne nesu di shini level shegi yores.
This is where perception occurs, in the brain, not in the retina.
Di la du dishe la di khol la ki yor la na leba na res an mi gi thagi di ma res.
Once we interpret this as a glass of chai, we can respond, pick it up, and drink it.
Ta nganzu di chai porba jimbe she sa je la nganzu khar chi la nganzu yalenti roas di le ani tung roas.
And that takes a whole other series of signals that originate in your cerebral cortex of the brain.
Ta thanda di chungye jura changma khol thanda cho di khol cha dur la nganzu le shun ji roas din a dio cha gi roas.
To activate motor neurons that then go back to your arm and your hand so that you can pick up the glass and drink it.
Ta thanda le shun din da tang gi roas di da di ma khanda yogu wang sa ra din gi ani lagwa yogu chi tu roas di genge.
So without the first step where we sense the image of the glass of chai, none of the rest happens.
Ta thangbo nganzu di thong at sam gi chorwa jura di male oina di gyurim chama ru ma roas thanda.
So there are several steps in what we referred to as sensory coding.
Ta thanda di wangsor da dewe nganzu kurim ji res.
We have to have a physical stimulus.
Ta nganzu dinal khari bugu yor la oina gyurim di dewe la chi gu jen ju bugu yor res.
That stimulus then changes the activity of neurons in the peripheral nervous system.
Ta thagor wangse mala jura di nala ani thanda wangse thabung gi chegu den ju gyo tang gi yor res.
These are referred to as sensory neurons.
Den jo la wangsor thasuk la gi yor res.
The information then from these neurons is transferred to the brain.
Ta di ne chu jra gyo jura di khol la du yor la oina level la tang gi yor res.
Or to the spinal cord, where it's then transferred to the brain.
Leba yang na jungbal tang gi res an dene ni ya pha ni shembal tang shi gi res.
Okay? This changes the activity in the brain, which then results in perception and a response.
Di thanda Jewish tu dos di kenge an nganzu dushe ke di da ani yalente jura di chungu res.
Next slide. All right. So, sense. This is the capacity to detect specific information from the environment.
Ta wangsor le di khar lana ne su chira ba su khori nu le jura di ha ko jura she di chagu res.
The five main senses that humans have are vision, audition, touch, taste, and smell.
Ta thanda mi na cha sha na mi wangsor khari gari cha dur lana ngadi thongsor che thesor reksor ani roi nyongsor che ani nomsor di cha dur res.
Now, other animals may have additional senses.
Ani ke socha shimba na la dilal ha be ya shimba nembe thanda wangsor ndi yor res.
Can you think of any examples of that?
Ta di maimbe ta wangsor shimba yor la ra socha shimba na di khana jo thingu dues thanda. Khari khari yosir ta di maimbe. Socha shimba na la da mi membe.
No? Okay.
She tu sama resa.
So how do bats who are blind locate things?
Ta phawang ro cha sha na khoran jo longa roas ra thongu yomar la roas ani konjo gi chala din jo ngobo din jo khandes ngozin thu res khawa khawa yome jora ne khawa yome di. By smell?
Not well, they can do it by smell, but they have a process or sense that's referred to as echolocation.
Ta thanda nganjo na phawang ro cha sha na thimai tisor di da yores di gan la khoran so la thanda wangsor thewa jores di la nganjo echolocation la yores echola na dabda ro la yo di ani thanda ne khari khari yome di ha ko.
So they create sounds, those bounce off of objects, and they can sense where those objects are.
Khoran chu gi thanda ne di khandes ngol jin thu yor la wainas thanda da tungu res da tundu ngobul dabgra dabni ani pharni surang ja ligi yores di wangsor jore di pheju chini ani khoran chu gi ngobu di khaw yome di ani ngojin chi tu yores.
Okay, so the five senses have specific neural processes and receptor cells for each sense.
Ta thanda wangsor re la ani tanda nilemba mixuka ni koranzo re yores thawanashi wangje yulam lawra di loga cha yores.
So we have the nose for smell, and there are specific receptors in the nasal cavity that detect chemicals that are in the air.
Tanda tizur chidunga zul khari lawna nilemba di naguna cha yoras dilo de ani lungi nang lo je khari yumi jora disu hakugur lawna tanda nilemba de naguna nilemba de ju shi yores.
There are specific receptors in the skin that are sensitive to touch, to pain.
Thawanashi nilemba mixuka niya lakwana yoras rekche chedu di kharchigur lawna ngajo nasuk da di yora reba da di insurgi yores.
There are specific receptor cells in the eye that respond to light.
Mixegi ya nilemba migna la yoras di kharchigur lawna yola nilen chinge cha yores.
Ear for hearing. And there are receptors on your tongue to taste chemicals that are introduced into the mouth. What these all have in common is that they transmit that sensory information into the brain where it's interpreted. So your tongue doesn't know that you have ingested something that's sweet. It's after the tongue and the nerves in the tongue transmit that information to the brain that you detect something that's sweet. You interpret it as sweet. So the organs that we have that are involved in this sensory process we call sense organs.
They're
the particular part of the organism that interfaces with the environment, collects the information, and then transmits it to the brain. So without the eyes, you would not be able to perceive things in the environment in a visual sense. So as I mentioned, for each of these sense organs, we have what we refer to as sense receptors. These are specific receptor cells or neurons. And they transduce this sensory information into a signal that is sent to the brain for interpretation. So for each of the senses, we have very specific receptor cells. For vision, we have two main types of sensory cells. There are rod cells, which are important for night vision or vision in dim light. And there are cone cells, which can see or can detect bright light and can detect colors. So these are very much like other neurons that you've learned about. In that they have a part of the cell that detects the input and a part of the cell that releases a neurotransmitter to act on other neurons.
다 단다 내주 둥에 디 가리 차도라나 타봉이 차시 디 차도레스 안 먼저 온서 단다 팀바된 좀 말르고 와서 디 데네로 차도레스.
So this end of the cell detects the light. It changes the activity of this cell, which then affects the release of the neurotransmitter, which then affects another neuron.
데네네 내주 링에 디 차도레스나라 데네네 아니 그림 주토니 내주 디 고알 당거라나 데라 왕자 팀바 균이 마 당거레스 왕자 팀바 디기 야 젤라 월라 가리올라나 왕자 타수 심바기 내주 디 링두레스.
For hearing, we have a sensory cell that's referred to as a hair cell.
다 토저 더 데웨 단다 타봉 주레스 딜라 먼저 가르라 고라나 다 파부 타봉 로덴데 차도레스 헤어 셀 라고레스.
They're called hair cells because they have these little cilia or processes that stick up here.
다단다 파부 타봉 가진 라고라나 스타트 헤어 셀은 타이 타봉 로레야 디나 가진 라고나 타도 부춘주 디요레스텔라 타봉.
And when a sound in the environment causes a vibration, it makes these hair cells processes move.
다 룽나 더구 충구로와스 디 충에 값수 안 디가다 타봉데 요로와스 파부 타봉데 디 니 요구 치요레스.
And that changes the activity of this cell where it releases a neurotransmitter.
딜라도 디 요구 치요 겐게 디 나로 치고 줘라 디 요두레스 차림디 디 단다 안 데네니 마 가르리고라나 왕자 팀벌리고레스.
For the sense of smell, we have what are called olfactory neurons.
다 nomsur da de ani nomsur ge 왕자 타수 디요레스 티술 다 de.
They also have little processes at the dendritic end.
단다 디 달린 사텐지도 디 인내 주라 델라이 쿠란조 단다 녜라 파부 도스 디나시 델라이 단다 수게 되 텐데 요 디요레스.
And these are able to detect substances, chemicals that are in the air.
다 단다 딘조기 커리 하고 요라오나 룽기 나로라 제다 규제 커리 요메 주라 디 다지싱이로 차디오레스.
And that will activate these neurons which transmit information into the brain.
대원나시 디 겐기 커리 라오나 디 왕자 타수디 디 치요레스 아 꾸긴치 아니 디네니 마 왕자 팀벌르고 요레스 젤라.
For taste, we again have another very specialized sensory cell.
The rodan dewe yang aran sugi mixukaniya mixi tapung yores di dan dewe.
And again, they have molecules that are able to detect other chemicals that you ingest into your mouth.
Tanashi di tapung di aran sugi ta khana la aran su khari lugo baina je khari mejura di shingi yores di.
Okay. Now, for the skin, and the sense of touch, there are many different kinds of receptors. Some of these are free nerve endings. And some of them have very specialized ends for detecting specific types of stimuli. Okay. So note, these don't look like the typical neurons that you probably studied last year. But in many regards, they act the same way in that they transmit information to other neurons using chemical neurotransmitters. All right, so this shows a typical setup for a neuron or a receptor that is sensitive to tactile information, so touch in the skin. So this is supposed to be the skin. A stimulus comes in and affects the skin.
ta papa de la khari gi shugen chi gorla na chini kugen ji li res digi papa de shugen ji ti res
It causes this cell to depolarize, the membrane potential of the cell to depolarize.
ta di nanglo la thabung gi nanglo la ngjo gi thanda kimu gi top se laura di ani ma gyo du res
That generates an action potential in the cell.
di gi ngjo le juk ni ba le jo di tungu res di gyo do kingi
Okay. And this cell is capable of going all the way into the central nervous system.
di thabung di khari yor la na dine go chu ne chini tewe wongza mala ba du res
So some of these are very long neurons.
chezan ta wongza tasu khashe dige ri di khari yor la rimbu shu yor res
So for example, a neuron in my big toe has an axon that projects all the way into the spinal cord.
ta thanda pe sha na khashe rimbu shu yor la ora dila du ko la ngjo kangbe theu ji yo dine ni wongza tasu chi gi ta ge za ri jura dine go chu na khaw ba de lir la ngjo kyumba ba de thungi digas rimbu li yor res
And so for me, that's a little more than a meter.
ta ngaran do cha sha na khagas li la na mirachi le has cha gi dos dirin se di ngjo tasu chi di
Think how long that neuron is for a giraffe.
ta nga do cha sha na mirachi gi has dolas ta shata kering la kiran zo samlo dang da khagas gi res dirin le
Long.
about 3 meters
So once the information is into the spinal cord, it gets transported through other neurons up into the brain.
ta din ne su dine go su ne jumba la le ros din ne su di jumba ni jela hol dur la na ya level la tang res ne su di
And so this is just one example, and you're going to find out over the week that the processing of information for the different senses is very specific.
ta thanda ne su do dan chik ten ros di la do on so re la koran so ne su do dan jora di mixe chera par re la mixe cha do res
So each individual sensory neuron can only respond to one type of stimulus.
di la do on so ne lem ba jora di ge ni ku jin re re mi su ka ni koran so thanda do cha de sa ku jin rang la an koran so yanin ti res
So this neuron that's responsive to touch is not responsive to light.
ta di wangza thasu do cha sha na di mi su ka ni khari che dure la na re cha da de cha de ras di re cha la ni yalin teng ji cha de res di ani da na ma zo thong zo da de cha yo ma res thasu di
Okay. So what we experience as sensation relies on an elegant set of mechanisms that's called sensory processing.
ta da na ma zo sore jo ra di khari da de cha de la na gyurim ji du res di wangso gi gyurim la yo res di la
This includes all of the secondary acts of information processing for the information to go from the sense organ into the central nervous system and to be perceived.
di la de ta thanda di ne su di khari cha de la na thanda ne len ba di ne su ling yo ras di ne su di ya gyurim di ma ta ni level ta chen di level na zin jo ra ne su di su yo res gyurim di
So we have to have a stimulus,
ngazol khari gugu la na kujen gugu res
and that's any form of energy that the body can detect.
tila du subu gi chowe da nibo hande ji na digi res di kujen di
Okay? There has to be a sensory receptor,
thana shi ni wangzor nelen pai gugu res dila
okay? And the sensory receptor is specific for a particular sense.
dila du wangzor re re la ni mixe ani tanda wangzor nelen pa re re loga cha de res
Then there has to be a sensory transduction mechanism.
di jala wangzor da jur chawa di cha de res
So this changes the energy or the stimulus into a change in the electrical activity of the sensory receptor cell.
ta tanda di khari gyo dang go lo na kujen tanda niba jora kujen ni chwa di khari liptung gyo du la wa na lokta la gyo du ras di wangzor di thabong di na
Okay? Then there has to be transmission of that change in electrical activity.
di la an ma den dong che jura di ma den di cha de res di khar la na onzo lo da jura di na gyo do di chu res
This then transfers that information into the brain,
di nesu di ani khol ya kedin chigur la na level adu yores
where it's integrated and further processed into something that we can interpret.
lebena la ni gurim mangbuch do ne ani di ngara so khari ra go la na tanda nesu ra jure di go chu yores.
Okay. Many of these processes occur in a graded fashion.
Di la du da ngara so di gurim ji do di chig jel chig doji di rimba doji yores dila.
So the strength of the stimulus will affect the strength of the information and the number of action potentials reaching the brain.
Thewana ji thanda di khari shiur la na kuji jore jora di ki shukse jora dil pa be ni nichu di khabas shukchelo dugu me da di jora cherim gurim gyo to da di lokda di khande stungu me di ani kujen gi shuk dil ra li yores di shukche wa na nichu di shukche dugu ya che di kujen dil ra li yores so di.
So here's just a schematic of the general anatomical organization of sensory systems in vertebrate animals, including human beings.
Ta thanda geru socha jora di nalo ani wangsu mala da de di kor tires di la du mi am su ros dina.
So we have peripheral sensory receptor cells.
Ta thanda dina la khari chu la na chi thanda thagor gi wangsu ne lem ba jora di chu res.
There are primary sensory neurons that have their cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system.
An ngarim gi wangza thasu yores di la de khoran zu wangza suk ju yo di suk di khol yor lo na wangza thanda thagor wangza mala del ne de yores.
These primary sensory neurons transfer information into the brainstem or the spinal cord, or in some cases through what are called the cranial nerves that go directly into the brain.
Ta thanda di nesu di khol dur la ta jungba che ani leshap che ani thanda ngzo thoru wangza yo dinde rig la du yores na thoru wangza le na nesu di thegar khol dur la na level la du yores.
Then there are sometimes various synapses between other neurons that relay the information into the cortex.
Kavri thanda thuga yorwas wangza thasu shemba nyamdo di ani dine ni thanda lebat thanda ya ni chu dia tang she yores thuga di juni wangza shemba ni.
Last year, did you learn about the thalamus?
Keran zo nani lebu kor la jang yorwas.
Yes. So the thalamus is a really important relay station.
Ta thanda ni chu chik ma tang ai jora di chisa gi thanda relay station da kingi gi da chodo chayora di ani thanda lebu di khechung shu chayoras ni ju yama tang ai di chik jel chik thuni tang ai jora di.
So for many senses, there are specific neurons or nuclei within the thalamus that transfer specific types of sensory information.
Di la du lebu nalo ta thanda tening ro la ora di cho tewa di khari cha de la na khashi gi ni su mixu kan chik rang tangi de ri gi yorwas dina.
Okay. You can think of the thalamus as a bus station.
Ta da nang zo thanda bus station yo di chijo langgor ka sa de ro cha sha na di yores lebu la di.
Let's say you want to go to Mumbai by bus.
Ta ngaran zo chashas Mumbai la dugu US kharina dugu la na zo chijulango na do ainas.
You can get on a bus in Mundgod that will take you to Hubli.
An thango Mundgod ni shungu roas chijulango na la. An di bus di call kiran zo call ki la na Hubli la ki roas.
This is analogous to the primary sensory neuron.
Di thanda khari ro chasha or la na ngarim gi wangsor mala ju di ro cha de res.
But then you get off of that bus at the bus station in Hubli to get onto a bus that takes you to Mumbai.
Ta deni Hubli le sa jela Hubli ni bus chijulango deni phagru was an chijulango shemba ji ga she an di Hubli ni Mumbai la kingi bus chijulango di cha de was.
So the bus station is like the synapse in the thalamus that is then transferring the information or you to the final destination.
Chesanta chijulango kasa jura di khari cha phabzu ro di kho cha khari cha de la na thuga di ro cha de res tanang zo lebu na thuga juras di ni ju chi ni le shemba dil tang yoras thunsam di ho thunsam di cha.
So the information gets transferred from the thalamus to specific areas in the cortex.
Di la du ta thanda lebu ni ne su di khol dang la na 네 믹스가 네 단다 먼저 레슈요라 네 로가 믹스에 땅셔요 레스디 네주디
So there are areas in the cortex that specialize for receiving visual information.
제산다 레슈라도 데라네 믹스가 네 로가 요레슬라라스 아니 믹스에 이네 카시 가리요라와나 통조르다 데베 니레마 차디요레스
There are other parts of the cortex that receive information about touch.
아니 네 카시 가리 차디요라나 렉처다 데베 디 이네출랭에 차디요레스
And others for hearing and all of the other senses.
딜라드네 제라가 로가 페샤나 다소레다 디 로가 요레스
So this is sort of the general organization, but there are exceptions to this, and we'll talk some about that as we go through the different senses.
딜라드다 지당기 조당 로디 디 차디요레스 딕주디 이네다 원소 레레 라믹세 조당 로가 요디 젤라티 이스 칼리글
All right, why don't we go to tea break now and come back in 30 minutes.
아니 단다 소저 퍼센 투즈 심손스라 소저 퍼센 페넨 추스 차가젤라 캬르도 제로 디 수즈라나 베르치스